Paul Geidel Jr. Paul Geidel Jr. holds the record for the longest prison sentence ever served by an inmate who was eventually released. He was incarcerated in 1911 at the age of 17 for second-degree murder and spent 68 years and 296 days behind bars before being released on parole in 1980. Despite his lengthy imprisonment, Geidel reportedly adapted to life in prison and chose not to pursue parole earlier, even when it was granted. Charles Fossard. Charles Fossard served 70 years in an Australian prison after being convicted of murdering his employer in 1903. He was just 19 at the time and remained in custody until his death in 1974. Fossard's case is unique as he served nearly all his life behind bars, illustrating the potential for extreme sentences to become de facto life imprisonment. Joe Ligon. Joe Ligon was sentenced to life in prison in 1953 at just 15 years old after participating in a robbery spree that resulted in 2 deaths. He served 68 years and was released in 2021, making him one of the longest-serving juvenile inmates in the U.S. Ligon declined parole opportunities earlier in life, insisting on being released without conditions. Albert Woodfox. Albert Woodfox spent 43 years in solitary confinement in Louisiana State Penitentiary for his alleged role in the murder of a prison guard in 1972. His prolonged isolation became a human rights issue, drawing international criticism. He was released in 2016 after a plea deal and maintained his innocence until his death in 2022. James Whitey Bulger. The infamous Boston mob boss James Whitey Bulger was captured in 2011 after 16 years on the run. Convicted of multiple murders, extortion, and other crimes, Bulger received 2 life sentences plus 5 years. Although he was murdered in prison in 2018, his story underscores the severe penalties imposed on organized crime leaders. Leonard Mack. Leonard Mack spent 47 years wrongfully imprisoned for a rape he did not commit. DNA evidence eventually exonerated him in 2023, making his case one of the longest wrongful incarcerations in history. His story highlights the need for justice system reforms to prevent similar tragedies. Elmer Wayne Henley. Elmer Wayne Henley is serving 6 life sentences for his role in the Houston mass murders of the 1970s, which claimed the lives of at least 28 young boys. Arrested at 17, Henley has been in prison since 1973, making him one of the longest-serving inmates still alive. Willie Bosket. Willie Bosket was convicted of murder at the age of 15 and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1978 under New York's Juvenile Offender Act. Bosket's violent behavior in prison led to his placement in solitary confinement for decades, with no possibility of parole. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. In 1924, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb committed the crime of the century, murdering a 14-year-old boy in a thrill killing. Loeb was killed in prison, but Leopold served 33 years before being released in 1958, highlighting how even infamous cases may not result in lifelong incarceration. Clarence Carnes. Known as the Alcatraz Kid, Clarence Carnes was sentenced to life imprisonment at just 18 for participating in an escape attempt that resulted in multiple deaths. He served over 20 years in Alcatraz and later transferred to other facilities, ultimately dying in custody. Thomas Hagen. One of the men convicted in the assassination of Malcolm X, Thomas Hagen, served 44 years before being paroled in 2010. His lengthy imprisonment reflects the gravity of crimes involving high-profile figures. Patricia Krenwinkel. Patricia Krenwinkel, a follower of Charles Manson, has been in prison since 1971 for her role in the Tate LaBianca murders. At over 50 years of incarceration, she is California's longest-serving female inmate. Leslie Van Houten. Another Manson family member, Leslie Van Houten, spent over 5 decades behind bars before being paroled in 2023. Her case illustrates the ongoing debate over rehabilitation and redemption for notorious criminals. Robert Stroud. Robert Stroud, known as the Birdman of Alcatraz, served 54 years for murder and was known for studying and writing about birds while incarcerated. His story inspired books and films, showing how inmates can leave cultural legacies despite long sentences. Eileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos, a convicted serial killer, spent 12 years on death row before being executed in 2002. While her time in prison wasn't as long as others, her case remains infamous due to its psychological and societal implications. Kazuyoshi Mura was a Japanese businessman who served over 25 years for orchestrating the murder of his wife. His case attracted global attention due to its cross-border legal complications and media coverage. Jason Vukovich, nicknamed the Alaskan Avenger, received a 28-year sentence for attacking sex offenders. His case raises ethical questions about vigilante justice and the limits of personal revenge. Bernie Madoff, the mastermind behind the largest Ponzi scheme in history, was sentenced to 150 years in prison in 2009. He died in 2021 after serving just 12 years, but his sentence remains symbolic of white-collar crime's devastating impact. Larry Nassar, former USA Gymnastics doctor Larry Nassar, received multiple sentences totaling over 300 years for sexually abusing hundreds of athletes. His case exposed systemic failures in protecting vulnerable individuals. Terry Nichols. As a co-conspirator in the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, Terry Nichols received 161 life sentences without parole. He remains incarcerated and is one of the most heavily punished domestic terrorists in U.S. history. James Earl Ray, the assassin of Martin Luther King Jr., was sentenced to 99 years in prison. He served 29 years before dying in custody in 1998, cementing his place in history as one of America's most infamous prisoners. Ted Kaczynski. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, is serving 8 life sentences without the possibility of parole for a mail bombing campaign that spanned 17 years. His manifesto and the subsequent investigation remain subjects of fascination. John List. John List evaded capture for 18 years after murdering his entire family in 1971. Upon his conviction in 1990, he was sentenced to life without parole, serving 12 years before his death in 2008. Dylan Roof. Dylan Roof was sentenced to death in 2017 for the racially motivated massacre at a Charleston church. Though not yet executed, his case highlights the persistent use of the death penalty for hate crimes in the U.S. Richard Ramirez, dubbed the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders and sentenced to death in 1989. He remained on death row for 24 years until his death from natural causes in 2013.